The survival horror genre is one that never ceases to fascinate me. While I can't say that even a fraction of the games in it actually managed to unnerve me, they are a seemingly endless wellspring of creativity that lends itself extremely well to serious subject matter, experimental game mechanics, or unorthodox storytelling. I feel like the big boom that led to this was Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil pushing the medium into the mainstream and leading to a massive influx of horror games during the PS1 and 2 era. Silent Hill, Echo Knight, Rule of Rose, Project Zero, and God knows how many more. Amongst these, however, was a little known game called Galerians, a small but very ambitious title by Polygon Magic, the same studio behind Incredible Crisis and of course the hit action game Seven Samurai 20XX. Meanwhile, the art was done by Masahiko Maezawa, who would go on to direct Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Echoes of Time. I originally played the first game several years ago, but recently decided to replay it for the sake of finally trying out the sequel, and I also watched the movie for good measure. Since it's also October, I think it's a perfect opportunity to give this short-lived series a video of its own. So without further ado... It's difficult for me to find the words to properly introduce this game because frankly the only one that comes to my mind is weird. And I mean that in a good way. Kinda. I'll get to what I mean in a bit, but first I want to talk about the game itself. The story follows a kid named Rion Steiner, who wakes up in a hospital where he's being injected with edgelord juice. Gameplay wise, it's your basic third-person survival horror game, tank controls and everything. Where things get interesting though is the combat. Thanks to his constant injections of gamer girl bathwater and sperm, Rion now possesses a form of autism so potent that it manifests as psychic powers. These are your weapons for the entire game. Instead of shotguns and flamethrowers, you'll get psychic blasts and the ability to turn anyone unfortunate enough to be in your general vicinity into barbecue. Later on you also unlock a third attack, but it comes quite late into the game and the charges for it are substantially rarer than the other two. So Nalcon and Dread will be your main means of attacks throughout most of the game. Conceptually all of this is really cool. The execution is where things get a bit iffy. In order to actually use these abilities you have to stand in place and charge them. Well, you can technically use them uncharged, but the damage and range will be so pitiful that you may as well have farted. You can't charge while moving or anything like that, so you really have to time the attacks. It's not like in Resident Evil or Silent Hill where you can just unload all of your bullets dealing the same amount of damage before you have to recharge either. To compensate, the enemies have surprisingly little health, but I would be lying if I said it wasn't frustrating at times. It's especially bad in the boss fights in late game as enemies love to move around a lot and are partly immune to certain attacks. You can temporarily increase both strength and charge speed of your attacks with an item called Skip, however the effect wears off really quickly and they're actually quite rare, so they're incredibly situational because of that. While all of these abilities are cool and all, they do come with a major risk, shorting. The more you use your psychic powers, the higher your short level rises, and once it's full, Rion will go berserk. Being in this state essentially turns you into a living nuke that kills everything in a 5-meter radius, except for bosses. However, if you stay in this state for too long, you'll, die. Once again, cool idea, but the execution is a mess. You tend to short rather quickly and thus to compensate they fill your inventory to the brim with Dalmator, that item that resets your short level to 0. This would be fine, but you have a very small and limited inventory so it gets cluttered quickly. Easily the coolest part of your moveset though is completely disconnected from the combat. Every time you encounter a locked door you can scan it with telekinesis to see exactly where you're going and the thing that will allow you to enter this room. It's a simple but clever way of eliminating that where do I go feeling that horror games of this era tend to have. Unfortunately, I've reached the end of my praises for this game, because man does it go downhill from here. There's 4 levels in the game, being a hospital, Rion's home, a hotel, and Trump Tower. The first 2 levels of the game are really strong, but everything after is a mess. The layout becomes mind-numbingly simple, puzzles continuously get less creative and more nonsensical as the story goes on, and the story itself it shits itself. It's a shame too, as the story is genuinely really interesting, but it ends up being filled with a mesmerizing amount of inconsistencies and plot holes. What doesn't help is that the localization is frankly utter dog shit, with a dub so bad it makes an elementary school drama club look like a god-tier performance of The Wolf of Wall Street. There's a common theory going around that the second half of the game was rushed due to deadlines, and honestly, that sounds very believable. Due in part to the fact that the game is so unbelievably short and ends on such an unsatisfying note that it feels like half of it was just cut. Overall, it's a solid enough experience, and with it only being, like I said, 5 hours long, there's much worse alternatives. I would definitely recommend it to fans of the first 3 Resident Evils and the like, as its ideas are legitimately really creative, and I could definitely see them improve upon in other games. However, Polygon Magic had something else in mind for the series, because what they put out before a sequel is quite possibly one of the most bizarre things I have ever seen. A fully CGI movie with a Western release that replaced the soundtrack with trash metal is generally not the first thing I think of when I think of PS1 horror games, but that's what we got. And man is it a trip. Good things first, the visuals are decent. Keep in mind I'm going off of early CGI standards here. It does capture the look of the in-game FMVs rather well, all things considered, though I'm really not sure if that's a compliment to the movie or an insult to the game. It also follows the plot closely as possible at least, to a fault, as it completely negates any possibility of them fixing up the plot holes or making any of the characters more interesting. And that's unfortunately where my praises end. The animations are incredibly stiff and frankly look wrong half the time. I don't know how better to explain it. Furthermore, this is one of the edgiest fucking things I've ever seen. And I don't mean the Shadow the Hedgehog saying damn and shooting guns kind of edgy. No, I mean the genuine, blood everywhere, intense screaming death metal background music using unnecessarily violent kind of edgy. The Japanese version uses a totally original score, but the Western release is a sight to behold, man. Though beside this is quite possibly one of the funniest Americanizations I've ever seen, up there with the Dragon Ball Z movies. I'll probably be showing the song list on screen, but I still find it necessary to mention some very specific bands that are featured, including but not limited to Slipknot, Skinny Puppy, Fear Factory, and Godhead. The only thing that's missing is Linkin Park, and then you'd have a complete set. If none of those names sound familiar to you, then may whatever god you believe in bless you for having forgotten all about the dark side of the early 2000s. This shit is so unbelievably funny to me, and every time I recognize the song, I started laughing hysterically. I obviously can't show any of those scenes in the video, as that would most certainly get it taken down, but if you go watch it, you can see for yourself just how funny it is. If you don't want to turn this into the best comedy you've seen all year though, the sub version is available on YouTube in its entirety. Link in the description. Obviously though, this movie didn't just exist because they felt like it. Well, actually the PSP UMD version of it might have, but that's a different story entirely. Either way, it was more so done to get people up to speed for the upcoming sequel, Galerians Ash. More like Galerians ass, am I right? Rarely have I ever seen a game where opinions have been this perfectly split down the middle. No matter where you look, people either really hate this game and consider it one of the worst sequels of all time, or just a mediocre and forgettable PS2 game. Where do I stand? Well, frankly I don't know. Visually, we've seen a massive improvement from the original. While still ugly, it doesn't lean nearly as much into the uncanny valley as the FMVs of the first game, while still retaining the same general art style. That's about where the similarities end, however. While Galerians was a classical survival horror stealth game, Ash plays like a shitty action game. The camera is now positioned behind Rion, with the player being able to lock onto enemies and dodge out of the way of their attacks. While the old offensive abilities of Nalcon, Red and D-Felon are still all around, their effects have changed up quite a bit. Instead of one big shockwave, Nalcon now sends out a barrage of smaller ones, capping off with a slightly bigger one. Red now burns an area on the floor in front of you and can thus be used like a shotgun of sorts, and D-Felon still just levitates enemies and slaps them to the ground. The single best change yet though is the ability to charge up attacks while moving. The way skip works was also changed. Instead of a temporary upgrade, it is now permanent. Yay. That's about it for good changes though, because holy fuck, this game is a mess! The game opens really strong, with a recreation of the final stage and boss of the first game. And that part's pretty damn cool, but the cracks already show. The bosses in this game have too much fucking health. It was bad in the first game, but this is just ridiculous. It only gets worse later on, as the level design becomes less and less sensical. Puzzles are barely even needed anymore because frankly, getting through the game itself is a puzzle. I got stuck several times because of how aimless this shit is. And unlike the first game, you don't have a scan ability which allows you to be nudged into the right direction either. Between levels, you also frequently return to your base of operations, where most of the exposition will take place. All dialogue is now fully dubbed, and while I'm not too fond of it, I've heard substantially worse before. The story is also just utter nonsense. A lot of it is either plot holes or completely illogical bullshit. I respect the ambition, but this game is about as much of a mediocre mess as it could possibly be. It's a shame that they did not stick to their survival horror formula, as I could have seen this become an awesome series had they refined it instead of making whatever this is. I hope someone picks these games out of the ground someday and gives them a thorough remake, because what's there is oozing with potential, and frankly, really awesome ideas. They're simply buried under a massive layer of overambition. And that concludes the Galerians franchise. While not perfect, or maybe even good by a lot of people's standards, I don't regret playing these games. I had a lot of fun buried underneath the frustration, and can wholeheartedly recommend the first game to anyone looking to scratch their PS1 survival horror itch. Also, I recommend the movie to anyone looking for something hilarious to watch while out drinking with the boys. The only thing here I wouldn't recommend is Ash, because while it does have a lot of great ideas, it's just not fun enough to make up for all of its shortcomings. With all of that said though, do me a favor here and have a great morning, day, evening or night. Cheers.